رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Now today inshallah we're going to go through a discussion regarding this version of the Muwaṭṭa as we mentioned, and bi'idhnillahi ta'ala after that we'll start the book. So this is the riwayah of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani of the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik rahimahullahu ta'ala. The first thing we discuss is what is the actual name of the book. So in this, as was mentioned by in the tahqiq of Shaykh Safwan Dawoodi, so whoever has this print you can actually look it up, it's on page 59. He mentions, Shaykh Safwan Dawoodi, he mentions 4 opinions regarding the name of this work. 4 opinions. Number 1, he says, the first name is Muwaṭṭa Malik ibn Anas, Riwayat Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Muwaṭṭa Malik ibn Anas, Riwayat Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. And that's the most obvious one. Literally, it means the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik ibn Anas through the riwayah of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. The second opinion, he says, is Muwaṭṭa Muhammad, not the Muwaṭṭa of Malik, directly attributed towards Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala himself, meaning Muwaṭṭa Muhammad. And he says, جاء عنوانه موطأ الإمام محمد بن الحسن الشيباني على أول مخطوطة دار الكتب المصرية. And this also came in some manuscripts, that it was called Muwaṭṭa Muhammad. Number 3, the third name, الاختلاف بين مالك بن أنس ومحمد بن الحسن. The book was called, in some of the manuscripts, it was titled الاختلاف بين مالك بن أنس ومحمد بن الحسن. The differences between Malik ibn Anas and Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. And number 4, الموطأ عن مالك ibn Anas إمام دار الهجرة رواية محمد ibn al-Hasan فقيه أهل الكوفة وبيان اختلافهما في أبواب الفقه. This is the longest name. The Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik ibn Anas, who is the Imam of Dar al-Hijrah, which is Al-Madinah al-Munawwarah, through the riwayah of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, who is the faqih of the people of Kufa, and clarification of their ikhtilaf in the abwab of fiqh, the chapters of fiqh. So these are 4 different names that have been presented upon or in the actual work. And Shaykh Safwan, he says the 4th name, Al-Muwaṭṭa, the long one, this is what he did i'timad of. And so on his book you can see it's titled Al-Muwaṭṭa an Malik ibn Anas Imam Dar al-Hijrah Riwayat Muhammad al-Hasan Faqih al-Kufa wa Bayan ikhtilafihima fi abwab al-fiqh. And then he says the first opinion, which is Muwaṭṭa Malik bi Riwayat Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani, that is the most famous one, and that is how it's most famously referenced. Although the second opinion, is also very, very famous. So for example, he mentions a bunch of scenarios where you can find in the works or the books of previous ulama that have called this work Muwaṭṭa Muhammad directly. They don't call it Muwaṭṭa Malik bi riwayati al-Imam Muhammad, they call it Muwaṭṭa lil-Imam Muhammad directly. And for example, in the Maktabatul Bushra print, that's what you have. Al-Muwaṭṭa lil-Imam Muhammad. It's not Al-Muwaṭṭa lil-Imam Malik bi riwayati Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. And likewise, he says in Fathul Bari, in one place he mentions في موطأ محمد عن مالك قال أخبرنا نافع. So he called it Muwaṭṭa Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. And likewise, in Fath, in other places, he mentions في رواية محمد ibn Hasan في الموطأ عن مالك, for example. And in other places in Fath as well, he says في موطأ محمد ibn Hasan. So the usage of the term Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad directly was prevalent and it did exist. And likewise, in the lands of the Indian subcontinent, you find them commonly referring to this book as Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad and not Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik through the riwayah of Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. So usually they will say, for example, that you will study al-Muwaṭṭa'ain, the 2 Muwaṭṭas. One is the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik and the second one is the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad. And sometimes students, they're not even aware that they're actually both the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik. It's just 2 separate riwayat, 2 separate variations, 2 separate narrators that are narrating it and transmitting it from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. But in reality, as we mentioned, it's actually the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik, and through the transmission of Imam Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani and Imam Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Why did it become famous in the Indian subcontinent as the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala directly? In fact, to the extent that there are some scholars that would say this is not the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik, this is the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad specifically. And they would say it's not right to say it's the Muwaṭṭa Imam Malik through the riwayah of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. The reason for this is because Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala in this work, he didn't simply transmit the book as he heard it from Imam Malik. If you look at the other variations, other transmissions of the Muwaṭṭa, you will find that all of those transmissions are simply transmitting the book as the student heard it directly from his teacher, Imam Malik. So whether it's Abdullah ibn Yusuf al-Tunisi, or whether it's Abdullah ibn Maslam al-Qa'nabi, or whether it's, for example, Ma'an ibn Isa, or whether it's, for example, Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri, or whether it's Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, or whether it's Abdul Rahman al-Qasim, in all of these different variations, you will find that the students are simply transmitting the book from the teacher. So Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi doesn't add anything additional in the book when he transmits it. He just transmits it directly the exact same way he heard it from his teacher. But the riwayah of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala is not like that. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala, he actually adds in his work, in his book, not only a hadith, but also statements regarding fiqh. So in reality, Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala over here is not simply transmitting only, he's not only transmitting the riwayat, the narrations from his teacher Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. Rather, he's adding to it. Especially when at times Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala mentions one dalil and it goes against, for example, let's say there's an opinion that the scholars of Medina are upon and it goes against what the scholars of Iraq are upon. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala over there, he'll mention a number of proofs just to prove exactly what the scholars of Iraq were also upon. To mention the mustadal of the scholars of Iraq. And anyone who has the version, you can actually, one place this happens a lot is on page 113. If you have this print, you can open it to page 113. The benefit of the print of Shaykh Safwan Dawoodi is that all of the additional ahadith that Imam Muhammad narrates, he printed them with blue ink as opposed to black ink, which is the actual version of Imam Malik. So all of the additional narrations that Imam Muhammad rahimahullah is narrating from teachers other than Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, they're printed in this print with blue ink so that you can recognize the difference. So on page 113, this is Babul Wudu'i min Masjid Dhakar. In the beginning, he mentions two narrations from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. After that, he says, قال محمد لا وضوء في مس الذكر وهو قول أبي حنيفة وفي ذلك آثار كثيرة. So Imam Muhammad rahimahullah over here went against the opinion of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala and the scholars of Medina. And he said, we in the scholars of Kufa and the opinion of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala is that wudu, you don't have to make wudu in this scenario. And then after that, he starts mentioning athar. And he mentions a number of them. So literally in this print, 4 pages, almost 4.5 pages, just mentioning a hadith not from Imam Malik, rather from other teachers, to prove that this opinion also is established, well established from the time of the Sahaba and the Salaf rahimahumullahu ajma'een. So Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala, in every single bab, he'll mention along with the ahadith 2 things that Imam Malik mentions. One thing for sure, and sometimes even the second. The first thing he mentions for sure is the opinion of the scholars of Iraq. So literally in every single bab, he'll mention the opinion of the scholars of Iraq. What was the opinion of Abu Hanifa? What was the opinion of Abu Yusuf? What was the opinion of the Amatul Fuqaha fil Iraq? He'll mention this opinion. And for example, if they agree with the scholars of Medina, which is in many masail, they agree. In those masail where they agree, he simply says, وَبِهِ نَأْخُذ. That's the same thing that we act upon as well. Meaning whatever Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala acted upon, and the opinion that he gave tarjih to, he gave preference to, that's the same opinion we act upon. And he mentions that is the qawl, that is the opinion of the majority of our ulama. At times, he adds upon that. So let's say there's a difference, meaning the scholars of Iraq differed with the scholars of Al-Madinah al-Munawwara. So Imam Muhammad will not only mention that we differed, so he'll mention the opinion of the scholars of Iraq, but on top of that, he'll also mention some of their proofs. So pretty much in every single bab, there's something he adds additionally. And if needed, he also adds a hadith additionally. So now, based on this, some scholars said it would be incorrect to consider this only a transmission of the Muwaṭṭa. Because pretty much in every single bab, Imam Muhammad is adding another fa'idah. He's adding benefit. So to consider this only a transmission of the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik rahimahullah would be incorrect. Rather, there is a degree of a strong degree of matters or different opinions and different discussions and subjects that Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala himself adds to the book. And that led them to some of them to saying that we should just call it the Muwaṭṭa Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala directly. That when you attribute the book, attribute it towards Imam Muhammad directly, and don't say it's the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik through the riwayah of Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. But even then, we say that the majority of the book still remains the transmission of Imam Malik. So yes, Imam Muhammad adds this pretty much in every single bab. And in some chapters he adds a lot of athar, additional athar. But overall, in the end, the majority of the book in terms of content, in terms of actual amount, the majority of it is still narrated from Imam Malik rahimahullahu ta'ala. So would it be such that you can literally start attributing the book entirely to Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala? That would be difficult. That would be difficult. Yes, if the majority of the book happened to be what Imam Muhammad was transmitting from his teachers, other than Imam Malik, and what he added, then yes, we can say that this work is the compilation of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. But since that's not the case, it's better to say it is the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik through the riwayah of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. Now this work, like we mentioned, that throughout the centuries, there has always been a continuous transmission of the books of hadith. But that doesn't mean that in every single century, literally this exact book was being read. And how do we determine in the past, in the centuries of the past, exactly when this work was being read and so on and so forth? So the way we will do that is that we look at the athbat of the mashayikh. Athbat is the plural of thabat. What is a thabat? The ulama, and this is actually I'll mention this point over here, is really important, which is that today, for example, when you graduate from an institution, a university or whatever institution you study, a seminary, they give you a degree. And that degree represents certification that you had studied in that institution. You completed, for example, a course, whether it's 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, however long it may be, and you attain that degree. And by way of that, people start recognizing you as a scholar or whatever profession you're in. They recognize you as an authority in that field, for example. The ulama of the past never had this concept of a system of giving or granting a degree when a person would go through a certain amount of years, and that's how they would recognize scholarship. So then the question is, how would they recognize scholarship? The way the ulama, so the concept of degrees, this came up later. This didn't exist in the past. How would the ulama of the past recognize scholarship? 2 things. What did you study and who did you study from? So when they were comparing between ulama, they weren't comparing between, okay, this person has this degree and this person has this degree and this person has this degree and so on and so forth. They were comparing 2 things. How much has he studied and who did he study from? And how long did he stay with them when he studied from them? So the books he studied and who he studied from. That's why we look into the tarajim of the ulama, all of the biographies of the ulama, when they talk about their ilm, they will all mention the shuyukh and the talamith. Who are their teachers and what did they study from each of these teachers? That's what they mention. This is how scholarship was recognized in the past. This tradition was left after the introduction of the system of degrees. And that has caused a lot of confusion in the eyes of the average individual. Why? Because now, in the eyes of the average individual, they are simply looking at titles. And now what's worse is that when you graduate from a certain institution and you attain a degree, then they stamp you with a title too. So they give you a title on top of that. So now the average individual is thinking, okay, how many titles does this person have? So the one that has 3 titles is better than the one that has 2 titles, and the one that has 2 is better than the one that has 1. But the titles, all they represent is that he went through an institution for a certain amount of time. That's all it represents. It doesn't actually represent how much he studied and who he studied from. Whereas the ulama of the past, how would they, for example, measure the standards of an alim? They would measure it by way of who you studied from and how much did you study. This is what they looked at. And where would they find this? They would find this in the athbat of Ahlul Ilm. So all of the scholars, they would compile a thabat for themselves. What is a thabat? A thabat is exactly this, where the scholar mentions, for example, he compiles himself and he mentions, I studied all of these books upon so-and-so teachers. I studied the Quran upon so-and-so teachers. I studied, for example, the books of hadith upon so-and-so teachers. The books of nahwa I studied upon so-and-so teachers. And I met so-and-so teachers, and in total I have so many teachers that have granted me ijazah, and they've permitted for me to transmit their works on behalf of them or from them. This is how the ulama of the past would recognize ilm. And this is how they would introduce themselves. So in terms of ta'aruf, if 2 scholars met, for example, they wouldn't be talking, for example, okay, I studied in this university, I graduated from here, and this so on and so forth. This came recently. They would be discussing what books they studied and who they studied from. Like, which one upholds the standards of ilm more? We say that the previous method. Because in the new method, in order to graduate from university, what makes us think that what occurs in Western academic universities is not the same that's occurring in Islamic universities? So the same way students, for example, they just want to pass the course and they will do whatever they can to pass the course. In fact, sometimes students, for example, just pay someone else to do the entire course for them if it's online. And they can take a ton of courses online. And this occurs, and everyone who goes through that system knows exactly that occurs. What makes us think that the Islamic universities are any different? The same exact thing is happening over there. In fact, I know students that would pay other students in Islamic universities to do their assignments for them, and then they will hand them in like that. So this occurs everywhere. It occurs in Islamic universities, because anytime you have an institutionalization of knowledge, that's what happens. So students, just to pass, they will do whatever they can. And then on top of that, usually what ends up in the eyes of the average individual, all they recognize is, okay, Fulan passed and Fulan also passed. They don't actually understand, or they don't look at the marks. And even if they looked at the marks, they don't actually understand how much each of them actually studied. So in the eyes of the average person, two individuals might have the same exact degrees. But in reality, they're going to be drastically different, of different levels when it comes to actual knowledge. And this is a big problem, a big problem. Because now it comes to the point where who do you give authorization when it comes to Islamic rulings? So the higher the degree, the greater the authorization. Like what if that individual hasn't actually studied traditionally any of these books? That's a big problem. That's why you end up having scenarios where you'll have individuals that have literally a PhD, like they're doctors, for example, they have a PhD in a certain Islamic science, and they can't read Arabic properly. And this has happened. They can't understand Arabic. They can't translate Arabic. And this actually occurs. Okay, so why would this happen? This only happens when you leave the traditional method and you totally change the entire method and you replace it with something which is very problematic. So now, how do we determine when the Muwaṭṭa was recited in the past? We look at the athbat of the ulama of the past. So if we can find, for example, of a scholar in the 6th century where he says, I studied the entire Muwaṭṭa through this riwayah upon my teacher, then we know it was being taught in the 6th century. We can find a scholar, for example, in the 5th century who says, I studied the Muwaṭṭa Imam Malik through the riwayah of Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani, then we know that it was taught in the 5th century. If we find a scholar, for example, saying this in the 9th century, we know it was taught in the 9th century. So what do we look at? We look at the athbat of the ulama of the past. So all we can say, Sheikh Ziyad Tukla in Manarat al-Salik, he mentions this. He says, قد بقيت تتداول سماعا في العراق إلى الآخر القرن السابع. Again, Imam Muhammad himself was from Iraq, and the Muwaṭṭa, by way of looking at the athbat of the ulama of Iraq, we can determine that this version of Muwaṭṭa, the riwayah of Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani, it continued and it remained to be transmitted sama'an, where the teacher would, the student would hear the entire book upon the teacher until the 7th century. So Imam Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani was in the 2nd century. Until the 7th century, we find it that it continued to be, it remained, the transmission remained until the 7th century. Then we also find that the transmission of this book was occurring in Mecca, in the city of Mecca, in the 9th century. And likewise, we find in the athbat of the ulama that this book was also being transmitted in the bilad of Muwaṭṭa al-Nahr, which is modern day Uzbekistan and the countries that are around Uzbekistan. And then we also find that the work was being transmitted in Egypt. So there are some gaps in between, but overall, until the 7th century, it was found in Iraq. We find it in Mecca in the 9th century. We find it in Egypt, for example, and we find it in the bilad of Muwaṭṭa al-Nahr. And this continued until the 10th century. So we find the transmission of this book continuously until the 10th century. And then we find another mass transmission of this book, which occurred on a mass scale, where many scholars were studying it and transmitting it, in the last, or in the 12th century. Now, you find it in the 12th century in Hijaz and Ash-Sham. So in Mecca and Ash-Sham, you also find it being transmitted in the 12th century. And then in the last 2 centuries, we find the majority of the transmission in the Indian subcontinent. Okay? In the last 2 centuries, we find the majority of the transmission of this book in the Indian subcontinent. It became lesser in the lands of Hijaz and Ash-Sham. And overall, the transmission of the books of Hadith in the last 2 centuries, a lot more is found in the Indian subcontinent as opposed to the lands of Sham and the Arabian lands in general. Now it's coming back to the Arabian lands. But for the past 2 centuries, you find the majority of the books of Hadith, including Bukhari and the other works as well, the majority of them were being transmitted in the Indian subcontinent. And he mentions that min fawaidi Abdul Hayy al-Kirtani in Fihras al-Faharis, he gathered, Fihras al-Faharis, a beautiful Fihras gathered by Sheikh Abdul Hayy al-Kirtani, who's the Musnid of our time. Of course, he passed away, and his son also was the greatest of the Musnidin in his time. He also passed away very recently, a few months ago, rahimahullah ta'ala, and he was above the age of 90. And those students who were able to get ijazah from him, they attained basically the highest asanid that could possibly exist, because his father was a great Musnid as well. And Shaykh Abdul Hayy al-Kattani used to take his son, Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Kattani, when he was young, to his own teachers, so that the son could also get ijazah from the teachers of his father. Okay, so Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Kattani was one of the greatest, in fact, the greatest Musnid, and he just recently passed away, rahimahullah ta'ala. So they mentioned, or he mentions in Fihras al-Faharis, his father, Abdul Hayy al-Kattani, he mentions in Fihras al-Faharis that إسناد رواية محمد بن الحسن نادر في فهارس المتأخرين فكيف بالمتقدمين. That the isnad of this work is rare even in the Faharis. Faharis is another word for athbat. So they used to call them athbat and they will also call them Faharis. In the Faharis of even the later scholars, it's something which is rare. So of course in the Faharis of the earlier scholars it's also going to be considered rare. Meaning the isnad is not something which is as common as some of the other books of hadith. Naam. طيب. Now, who are the shuyukh of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala in this work other than Imam Malik? As we mentioned, Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala narrates from a number of teachers other than Imam Malik in this work as well. Shaykh Safwan, he mentions in his tahqiq that the amount of shuyukh that Imam Muhammad narrated from in the Muwaṭṭa other than Imam Malik were 44. Imam Muhammad narrates a hadith in this work from 44 teachers other than Imam Malik ibn Anas rahimahullahu ta'ala. And the amount of ahadith and athar he narrates from them in total are 98. So 98 narrations from ahadith and athar that are not being transmitted through the tariq or through the way of Imam Malik rahimahullahu ta'ala. And who are these shuyukh? We have Ibrahim bin Muhammad al-Madani and Ibrahim bin Yazid al-Makki and Usama bin Zayd al-Madani and Israel bin Yunus. And if you have this print, then you can open it and he has the entire chart in the beginning of the print. Naam. On page 25. The entire chart you'll find on page 25, 26, 27, and 28, along with the ahadith he's narrating from each of them. Along with the number of the hadith that he narrates from each of them. So for example, Ibrahim bin Muhammad al-Madani, hadith number 15 and 16, he narrates from this shaykh. Likewise, you have one of the greatest ones, Imam Abu Hanifa. So there are a number of narrations that Imam Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani in this work narrates through Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. 19, 20, 60, 137, 247, 307, 308, 658, 659, 746, 747, 754, and 792. All of these narrations are through Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. Likewise, Imam Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani rahimahullah in this work, he narrates from Sufyan al-Thawri as well, who's the great muhaddith of Kufa. Great muhaddith of Kufa. He narrates 4 narrations through him. Hadith number 74, 128, 143, and 1155. Likewise, he narrates from Sufyan ibn Uyayna, who is the great muhaddith of Mecca. So, hadith number 141, 748, 920, and 921. And likewise, Shu'bat ibn al-Hajjaj, and others as well. Abdullah ibn Abdurrahman ibn Ya'la. And likewise, Al-Fudayl ibn Ghazwan, and Muhammad ibn Abi Dhi'b, and Mis'ar ibn Qidam, who's also a great scholar of Kufa. And Yaqub ibn Ibrahim Abu Yusuf as well. He narrates 123, 124, 312, and 460. So Imam Muhammad rahimahullah had a number of teachers that he studied hadith from, and he transmitted a hadith from, and great teachers as well. And we find all of that found in this work. Shaykh Safwan also, right after he mentions the list of the shuyukh, he also mentions the hukum, meaning according to the scholars of Jarh and Ta'deel, what is the rank of each of those teachers of Imam Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani that he narrates from. And you can find that in the muqaddim of his work. How many ahadith are in this Muwaṭṭa in total? In the Tab'a of Shaykh Abdul Wahhab Abdul Latif, he mentions 1,008 narrations in total. 1,008 narrations in total. And as for Al-Laknawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, فجميع ما في هذا الكتاب من الأحاديث المرفوعة والآثار الموقوفة على الصحابة ومن بعدهم مسندة أو كانت أو غير مسندة 1180 1180 1180 in total. And Shaykh Safwan says that we continue. Now why this is a really important point over here, is that why in the world, if it's the same book, why do they differ in the amount of ahadith that are mentioned in the book? There are a number of factors and reasons for this. The most common reason is, the most appropriate reason, is that when would you consider a narration a separate narration? Sometimes ahadith are merged together. And so someone might consider them one narration, whereas in reality, according to the majority of muhaddithun, in reality they should be considered two separate narrations. Like for example, let's say there's one narration, and like for example, Imam Malik rahimahullah or Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, he goes to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam using one chain, and then he transmits the hadith, and then he says right after that I also have another chain that grants me the same narration. Do you consider this two separate narrations, or do you consider it one narration? Some might think because the actual matan of the hadith, the actual text of the hadith is one narration, so it just puts one number, and his additional sanad that he added in the back after the narration is simply just with corroboration, or it's just to solidify the initial sanad, the initial chain that he mentioned. But in reality, according to the muhaddithun, this is actually two narrations. Each chain is a separate narration according to the muhaddithun. In fact, each additional benefit in each chain would be considered a separate narration according to muhaddithun. So because of that reason, sometimes when the scholars, when they mention the numbers of ahadith, sometimes they might consider two narrations in reality one narration, and it might slip their mind. And the last time when we actually read this hadith upon Shaykh Safwan himself, Shaykh Safwan, he was trying to, so what he would do is, one is then he would add the normal number that is common in the work, and then on top of that he would add another. So if you look in the work, there's actually two numbers that are there. One is in red and the other one is in brackets in black. So the one in brackets in black is in line with the numbering of the previous scholars. And as for the one in red, it's his own numbering that he's adding based on what he feels should be an extra hadith. Like for example, if you open page 194, for those of you that have the book, if you open page 194, in this is very beautiful. You see this being applied right over here. What's the chain? قال أخبرنا محمد عن مالك قال أخبرنا عطاء الخراساني قال سعيد بن المسيب. This is the statement of Sa'id bin Musayyib. من أجمع على إقامة 4 أيام فليتم الصلاة. After this he says قال محمد ولسنا نأخذ بهذا يقصر المسافر حتى يجمع على إقامة 15 ليلة. طيب, then he says وهو قول ابن عمر, meaning what I just said is the statement of Ibn Umar, وسعيد بن جبير وسعيد بن المسيب. Shaykh Safwan added a separate number for each one of these statements. When he said وهو قول ابن عمر, that is the statement of Ibn Umar, Shaykh Safwan added a number. وسعيد بن جبير, Shaykh Safwan added a number in his tahqiq. وسعيد بن المسيب, he added a number. Because when you transmit a statement to someone else, that is a separate number in a hadith altogether, according to tariq of muhaddithin. Whereas the previous one, if you see in the brackets is 199, it remains 199 until the next hadith. Then it becomes 200 in the brackets, in the black. So depending on how the author or how the muhaqqiq is willing to count the narrations, that's why there's difference sometimes in the actual number of a hadith. And that's why he says that the amount of ahadith after the numbering that he did was 1,228. And even this numbering, we actually, subhanAllah, during our recitation, a recital upon him, we came across certain things that even he missed. And when we come across it, he would write it in the beginning of the book so that the next edition of this book would make sure that they add a separate number to, they fix it and they add a separate number to it altogether. So it's normal. Sometimes a person can, for example, while reading, and obviously the manuscripts don't have any numbers. So it's up to the publisher. They're the ones who have to place the numbers and so on and so forth. طيب. And then he mentions, so the total amount of ahadith are 1,228, and from them are 209 from other than Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, from the balaghat of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala. طيب. What are some of the famous shuruh that have been compiled upon this version of Muwaṭṭa? Number one, Shaykh Al-Imam Qasim bin Qutlubugha, he has a ta'liqa upon the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. Al-Sakhawi, he mentions this in Ad-Daw' al-Lami'. And likewise, Ibn Qutlubagha also has Rijalu Muwaṭṭa'i Muhammad. So he spoke about the narrators that are mentioned in this version of Muwaṭṭa. طيب. Likewise, we have شرح مشكلات موطأ الإمام مالك بن أنس رواية محمد بن Hasan, which was compiled by Mullah Ali Qari, the famous Hanafi scholar. And he has many books in many different aspects, and he also has a sharh on the Muwaṭṭa Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, although he doesn't go into super detail in this sharh, but it is a good sharh for students. Likewise, we have Al-Fath al-Rahmani bi Sharh al-Muwaṭṭa, which was compiled by Ibrahim bin Hussein, who's known as Ibn Biri, who passed away in the year 1099. And this is currently, the tahqiq of the book is currently being done in Al-Jami'a Al-Islamiyya, in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, but we have a manuscript version of this sharh. Number 5, we have Al-Muhayya Sharh al-Muwaṭṭa, which was compiled by Uthman bin Yaqub al-Kamakhi, who passed away in 1171. 1171, and this is printed and published. And then we have At-Ta'liq al-Mumajjad Sharh Muwaṭṭa Muhammad, which is a compilation of Al-Allama Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi, who was one of the greatest scholars, who passed away in the year 1264, or he passed away in the year 1304. He was born in the year 1264. And this alim, subhanAllah, he lived less than 50 years of age, but one of the greatest ulama that we know in the past 2 centuries. And this version is also, or this sharh is also printed. And we have Al-Muhalla Sharh al-Muwaṭṭa, compilation of Salamullah bin Shaykh al-Islam al-Bukhari al-Dihlawi, who passed away in the year 1229 Hijri. Likewise, we have Al-Qawl al-Musaddad fi riwayati Muwaṭṭa al-Imam Muhammad, which was compiled by Shaykh Idris bin Abdul Ali al-Nakrami. And we have Al-Muwaṭṭa lil-Imam Malik ibn Anas bayna riwayati Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi wa Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. This is actually a dirasa that was done, compiled by the researcher John Fahlifi al-Indonesia. And it was a Risala Magister in Kulliyat Usul al-Din, which he compiled in Sudan. And we have الاختلاف الفقهي بين مالك ومحمد بن حسن الشيباني من خلال روايته للموطأ دراسة فقهية مقارنة, compiled by Dr. Idris Umar Muhammad. It's also a دراسة فقهية, a research paper that was done mentioning the اختلاف فقهي between Imam Malik and Muhammad, looking at this riwayah of the Muwaṭṭa. Likewise, we have اختيارات الإمام محمد بن حسن الشيباني الفقهية من خلال روايته لموطأ الإمام مالك, which is a number of رسائل علمية that were given to different students that were doing their masters in Kulliyat al-Sharia and Jami' al-Azhar. And then he mentions the dirasat that they compiled in this regard. So there are a number of works that were compiled upon this. And overall, the Muwaṭṭa in general, a lot of these ahadith that you'll find over here are also found in the Muwaṭṭa Imam Malik rahmatullah through the riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. So all the shuruh of that will also assist you over here. And a lot of these works were actually transmitted by Imam Bukhari, or a lot of these narrations were transmitted by Imam Bukhari rahmatullah in his Sahih, and Imam Muslim rahmatullah in his Sahih. So you'll also find those shuruh that can also assist you on the sharh of these ahadith. Now, regarding Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani himself, what was the rutbah of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani? So we say Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani, he is a mujtahid mustaqil. Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, the 2 students of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, some scholars have mentioned that they are considered mujtahideen within the Hanafi madhab. The correct understanding, the correct opinion over here is that they are mujtahideen mustaqilleen, meaning they themselves are mujtahideen, and not only mujtahideen in furu', which would mean subsidiary issues and opinions, but rather in the usul, in the principles of fiqh, in legal theory itself, they are considered mujtahideen. They are considered mujtahideen. Then why is it considered one madhab? So in reality, the Hanafi madhab is composed of the opinions of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad Hasan Shaybani. If they are, in reality, the 2 of them are themselves mujtahideen, why is it considered one madhab? The reason why it's considered one madhab is overall, or a few factors. Number 1, overall they adopted the same approach. So yes, even if in usul they differed, they still were overall upon the same approach in usul in comparison to the other approaches in usul that was found in Al-Madinah al-Munawwara at that time. So really in the 2nd century there were 2 main madaris that existed of ijtihad. One was the madrasa in Al-Madinah al-Munawwara, the scholars of Al-Madinah, and number 2 was the madrasa in Al-Hijaz, the madrasa of Kufa. So these 2 were the main 2 madaris fiqhiyah that existed in the 2nd century. After this, Imam Ash-Shafi'i rahimahullah came, and he combined from both of them, and he also studied from the students of Al-Layth ibn Sa'd in Egypt, and he came up with his Al-Madhab al-Qadim first and then Al-Madhab al-Jadid, and he added an additional approach. But overall, the approaches were of 2 approaches: the madrasa of Al-Madinah al-Munawwara and the madrasa of Kufa, of Al-Iraq. And so in general, Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf, overall they are all from the madrasa of Al-Iraq in comparison or in contrast to the madrasa of Al-Madinah al-Munawwara. So for this reason, they are all considered to be upon one madhab. That's the first factor, or first reason. Number 2, they compiled their ahkam fiqhiyah together. And who is the one who compiled them? Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. So in the Kutub of Zahir Riwayah, Imam Muhammad will mention the opinion of Abu Hanifa and the opinion of Abu Yusuf and his own opinion, and then sometimes he will mention the opinion of Al-Hasan, Al-Lu'lu'i and Zufar as well. But overall, their opinions have all been transmitted together in the same works. And that's why even in this book, Imam Muhammad, he will always mention وَبِهِ نَأْخُذ, and he'll say, for example, this is the opinion of Abu Hanifa and the opinion of Abu Yusuf. He mentions this explicitly in all of the abwab. That's why he says, for example, قال محمد وبهذا نأخذ. After that he says وهو قول أبي حنيفة والعامة من فقهائنا. This is very common in Muwaṭṭa of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. So for this second reason, we say that the madhab remained as one madhab, because the compilation was all done together. Now, third factor, as it was taught as a madhab, it was all taught together. So the ulama that came after Imam Muhammad and after Abu Yusuf, their students, and then their students, and then their students, they transmitted the opinions of these three imams, great imams, together as one madhab, as one school of thought. And they explained them together as one school of thought. And they connected them together. And they mentioned where they agreed and where they disagreed and so on and so forth. But they presented it as one school of thought. And then it evolved, like every single school of thought evolves, until we have the final version of the Hanafi madhab today, which has evolved drastically. And many thousands of scholars have worked on this over a thousand years, and until we have the final image of the madhab that we have today. So for this reason, we say it's one madhab, which is known as the Hanafi madhab, and the attribution of the madhab is done to Al-Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. But even then, the majority of them, Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, in many opinions, they're actually following Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. So usually if the masail are coming from above them, meaning if there's khilaf amongst the tabi'un and amongst the sahaba, usually you'll find that Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, they give tarjih to the opinion of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. This is very common. Not always, but it's very common. And in fact, some went to the extent of saying, oh, Imam Abu Hanifa, the majority of his opinion, he simply gives tarjih to Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, and therefore we shouldn't consider him a mujtahid. But that is incorrect. That is incorrect. Because Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala wasn't only giving tarjih to one opinion over the other, he would also explain it and expand on it. And sometimes he would differ. Sometimes they would differ. Sometimes in the Hanafi madhab, although this is rare, but sometimes in the Hanafi madhab you'll find that they give an opinion against the opinion of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud himself. They hold an opinion against the opinion of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala himself, which is uncommon. But it happens. So even if they were, yes, majority of what they were upon was taken from their teachers, like every single madhab is transmitted down in this manner, even then we will still say that this was Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala is a mujtahid mustaqil, and likewise Abu Yusuf, and likewise Imam Muhammad. And what is ijtihad in reality? Ijtihad is simply the ability to do tarjih between multiple opinions. Now, so both of them, meaning Imam Muhammad and Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala and Abu Yusuf, they were both mujtahideen. So now, what is the manhaj of Imam Muhammad in his work Muwaṭṭa, in this version of Muwaṭṭa? So number one, we say يبدأ بذكر الأحاديث المسندة عن الإمام مالك. He'll start off in each bab he'll start off by mentioning the ahadith that Imam Malik rahimahullah, go through the chain of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. So he mentioned that Imam Malik informed me, and he'll mention the chain of Imam Malik until the hadith. And then, right after he mentions the hadith and the athar from Imam Malik, in a very short, sometimes one line, sometimes half a line, sometimes 2 lines maximum, sometimes 3 lines maximum, he'll mention his opinion and the opinion of the fuqaha of Kufa and his teachers Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf rahimahumallahu ta'ala. Majority of the abwab he does this. And let's say he agrees with Imam Malik. In that situation he simply says وَبِهِ نَأْخُذ, that we take the same opinion. وَبِهِ نَأْخُذ, meaning we take the same opinion that Imam Malik adopted. But if he disagrees, then he'll mention his own opinion, and then he'll also bring certain athar that would suggest and prove his opinion. طيب. What if Imam Muhammad himself, though, differs with Abu Hanifa? He also mentions that. So majority of the times, he'll start off, the first opinion he will mention is his own opinion. When he says, وَبِهِ نَأْخُذ, he's referring to himself. And after that, he will say, وَهُوَ قَوْلُ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ وَالْعَامَّةِ مِنْ فُقَهَاءِ, if they all agree. And that is the majority. The majority of the opinions, they always agree. But in some matters, Imam Abu Hanifa differs. And Imam Muhammad adopts an opinion other than the opinion of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. So he'll mention that Abu Hanifa over here, he differed. Imam Abu Hanifa over here, he differed. Okay? So he specifically mentions and the opinion of Abu Hanifa as well. Likewise, from the manhaj of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala is that Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala, he only uses the term akhbarana in transmission from Imam Malik and his teachers in general. He does not use the term sami'tu, and he doesn't use the term haddathana. طيب, now those of you that have studied mustalah, you know that there's a difference amongst the mutaakhirun. The later scholars of mustalah, they differentiate between these terms. They say حدثنا is for a specific scenario, سمعت is for a specific scenario, and أخبرنا is for a specific scenario. So why is Imam Muhammad only using the term أخبرنا? So to this we say that the earlier scholars, the majority of them would not differentiate, or many of them would not differentiate between these terms. So the scholars of Hijaz in general would not differentiate between the term أخبرنا and حدثنا. They would use it for the both عرض and سماع. Again, the students of Mustalah, you already know this terminology. They would use it for both scenarios. So for example, one scenario is where the student hears the hadith from the wording of the teacher, meaning the teacher says the hadith and the student hears it. And the other one is where the student reads the hadith and the teacher, he just affirms. So the student is the one reading and the teacher says, yes, that's correct. Some scholars of hadith would say that for the first one, which is the teacher says the wording and the student hears, we use the term حدثنا. But as for the second one, where the student is the one who reads and the teacher simply affirms, we use the term أخبرنا. Some ulama differentiated between حدثنا and أخبرنا in this manner. But we read that Imam Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala heard the Muwaṭṭa directly, the majority of the hadith or many hadith from Muwaṭṭa heard it directly from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. So the term he should be using is حدثنا, if you take this understanding. But then he still uses أخبرنا. So he always, in all of the works, you'll find them, he uses أخبرنا, he doesn't use حدثنا. Why is that the case? So we're saying in his time, or he was upon the opinion, that they wouldn't differentiate between حدثنا and أخبرنا. They would not differentiate between حدثنا and أخبرنا. This was adopted by scholars in the 3rd century onwards. As for before that, they would normally consider the two the same. طيب. Likewise, from the عادة of Imam Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani in this work is that in some masail he says هذا حسن أو جميل and words of the sort. And when he says هذا حسن or he says هذا جميل, for example regarding a mas'ala, the hadith mentions a mas'ala or a scenario, and Imam Muhammad says هذا حسن or he says هذا جميل. He doesn't intend by that the meaning of istihbab in fiqh. So the fuqaha, they have a terminology which is mustahab. Is Imam Muhammad intending that? The answer is no. Rather, Imam Muhammad is intending by that something which is a very generic form of husn, which is anything that's other than wajib. كل ما يقابل الواجب حسن. So even if it's mubah, for example, or it's mustahab, or it's sunnah, for example, he uses the term sometimes هذا جميل or هذا حسن. And this also takes us to another point, which is the mustalahat, the terminology of the ulama. It's very, very important for a student of knowledge to understand how these terms evolved over time. And this all of the terminologies in all of the disciplines, they became more precise over time. So for example, the terminologies that are adopted by Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar in Nukhbat al-Fikr, and he says this hadith is called so and so, the mursal hadith is called this hadith is called this. All of these terms, if you look at the earlier scholars of hadith, you will find that they're using them interchangeably sometimes. And likewise, the terminology that is mentioned by the scholars of usul al-fiqh, the legal jurists. For example, they say am is one thing, mutlaq is one thing, and they define them with very specific definitions, and they differentiate between the two of them. So am and mutlaq are different according to the scholars of usul, later scholars of usul. But the earlier scholars of usul used to use the two terms for the same meaning, interchangeably. Sometimes they use mutlaq for am and sometimes am for mutlaq. Okay, so the terminologies that are adopted by the fuqaha in every single discipline, in the discipline of fiqh, and the discipline of usul al-fiqh, and the discipline of usul al-hadith, they evolved over time and became more precise over time. Those same terms possibly could be used by earlier scholars for a different meaning. And a student really needs to understand this. Why? Because otherwise you're going to think they are differing. So for example, later scholars are using a term and the earlier scholars are using a term, and you're like, wait, we find in the work of Imam Muhammad that he said regarding so and so that the later scholars say it's sunnah mu'akkada, for example. And Muhammad in his book he says هذا حسن. It's good. So the later student thinks that, okay, the student who's used to the terminology of the later ulama thinks, okay, Imam Muhammad is saying it's just mustahab. So why are the ulama in the books of fiqh saying it's actually sunnah mu'akkada? And there's a difference between sunnah and istihbab. So the reason for this is a lack of understanding or misunderstanding regarding how the evolution of these terms occurred within each discipline. In each discipline, this has to be studied separately. And you have to study how the terms or which terms were used by the ulama and what they intended by it when they used those terms. And normally you'll find in the 2nd century, 3rd century, there is a degree of a lack of precision when it comes to the terms. And as time goes on, they become more and more precise. And that's a natural progression in any discipline. That's what you would assume. Anything you start in the beginning, it's a bit, the organization is lacked or lacking. And as time goes on, it becomes more and more precise. Same thing occurs over here. طيب. Now, we'll finish this off by comparing the riwayah of Imam Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani and Imam Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. There are pros and cons again to both of these two versions of Muwaṭṭa. But we'll mention some of the pros that are specific to the riwayah of Imam Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani. Number one, Imam Yahya bin Yahya did not hear the ahadith from his teacher, Imam Malik himself. Whereas Imam Muhammad, the majority of the ahadith, he heard them from the teacher. And this is a miza amongst the muhaddithun. The muhaddithun, they say, السماع من لفظ الشيخ أولى من العرض على الشيخ. Meaning for you to hear the hadith from the teacher himself is better than for you to read the hadith and him simply affirming. Why is that the case? Let's say you're reading the hadith and the teacher is affirming. It's possible that the teacher might, for example, doze off. Sometimes he might lose focus. That is possible. And if he loses focus, and let's say you made a mistake, and the whole point is the point is that you have to correct your nuskha, your version in line and make it in line with the version of the teacher. So if he loses focus and you make a mistake and he doesn't notice and he doesn't correct you, so you think that you received that nuskha completely from the teacher, but in reality there's a mistake in it. This does not happen, and it cannot happen if the teacher is the one reading. Yes, one student can lose focus. But one student losing focus is not as big of a deal as the teacher losing focus. Why? Because normally when a teacher teaches, how many students are there? 10, 15, 20, 30, sometimes a lot more than that, 100, 200, 300. So even if one student loses focus, the other student has focus. So the mistakes that occur on the individual basis of each student can be fixed by looking at the other students, the versions that are attained by the other students. But if the teacher makes a mistake and the teacher dozes off and he doesn't correct, that cannot be fixed by anyone. Because none of the students would get it right at that point. So this is why they say, this is one of the reasons they say that hearing the teacher read the hadith is better than you reading, the student reading the hadith upon the teacher. But Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala would not be fine with this. Many students would come to him and say that we want to hear the hadith from you directly. He would say no. He would tell them, when you go recite the Quran, you hear the Quran from your teacher or you recite it to the teacher? When you recite Quran to your teacher, you recite it to the teacher or you hear the teacher reciting Quran to you? You recite it. That's how you learn from a teacher. Okay, so he says, Al-Ard, if that can occur in the Quran, then why can't it occur in the hadith? That's why Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala would get angry. He wouldn't read a hadith to students from himself. He would have a reader, or one of the students reads, he himself would not read the hadith. But the students that stayed with Imam Malik for a long time, some of them were able to hear a hadith from Imam Malik himself. And from them was Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani. From them was Imam Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani. Meaning sometimes Imam Malik would read. And Imam Muhammad, as we mentioned, heard over 700 ahadith from Imam Malik himself. Okay, so that is a great miza. That is in the riwayah of Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani as opposed to Imam Malik. Also, Imam Muhammad spent a longer time with Imam Malik compared to Imam Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Imam Muhammad spent 3 years with Imam Malik, where Imam Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi did not spend 3 years with Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. Likewise, the Muwaṭṭa of Yahya only has a hadith from the version of Imam Malik, whereas the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad has a hadith from Imam Malik and also from other than Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And obviously bringing a hadith from other than Imam Malik is better than only mentioning the hadith of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. Likewise, Imam Muhammad, in reality, when you study this book, you are studying a summary of the major schools of thought that existed in the 2nd century. The 2 major schools of thought, you will find both of them in this book. The Iraqi madrasa as well as the Madani madrasa. But you don't get that if you only study the version of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, because Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi simply transmitted what Imam Malik said and nothing else. So you don't get a comparison between opinions. But in this version, you get a comparison. So you get the opinion of Imam Malik and you also get the opinion of the Iraqiyun if they differ. And sometimes you even get the proofs of the Iraqiyun. So it's a book, if you were to study it, you would get more benefit overall in terms of understanding the major opinions that were held by the scholars at that time in comparison or compared to simply studying the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan or Imam Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Likewise, from the benefits of this work is that Imam Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, he made mistakes. As we mentioned. There weren't a lot, but he made mistakes. He had awham. Whereas Imam Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani did not have awham. Rather, many scholars have mentioned when it comes to Muwaṭṭa specifically, Imam Muhammad is a thiqah. He is a thiqah. So these are overall, we can mention a number of what will give preference or what will give tarjih to the riwayah of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani over the riwayah of Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi. And if you want more regarding this, you can look at Ta'liq al-Muwajjad. He mentions a lot more. طيب, now, نعم. What are some of the ziyadat that are mentioned in the riwayah of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani? So Imam Muhammad also has certain ahadith that are not found in some of the other versions of Muwaṭṭa. And there's one very famous hadith which is very, very important that is not found in the other versions of Muwaṭṭa. And that is the hadith of إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّةِ. Hadith number 1202. Hadith number 120. نعم. 1202. This hadith, if you look at it, if you have this version and you open the hadith, Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani narrates from Imam Malik ibn Anas, who narrates from Yahya bin Sa'id al-Ansari, who narrates from Anas ibn Malik. No, the one after that. يحيى بن سعيد الأنصاري قال أخبرنا محمد إبراهيم التيمي قال سمعت علقمة بن وقاص يقول سمعت عمر الخطاب رضي الله عنه يقول سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول أن الحديث إنما الأعمال بالنية وإنما لامرئ ما نوى. In the Hashia, Shaykh Safwan mentions that Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala in Fath al-Bari, he said وَوَهِمَ مَنْ زَعَمَ أَنَّهُ فِي الْمُوَطَّةِ. This hadith was transmitted by other scholars such as Imam Bukhari and Muslim in their Sahih through the chain of Imam Malik. And some scholars mention that this hadith إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّةِ is also mentioned in Muwaṭṭa. Ibn Hajar said that's a mistake. Because Ibn Hajar had not come across this hadith in any other version of Muwaṭṭa. And it's possible he didn't study this version of Muwaṭṭa. And so he believed that was a mistake. That was a mistake. Meaning that this hadith is not actually mentioned in the Muwaṭṭa. But in reality, the hadith is mentioned in the Muwaṭṭa. It's mentioned in the Muwaṭṭa through the riwayah of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. And that's why As-Suyuti rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, رواية محمد بن الحسن صاحب أبي حنيفة وفيها أحاديث يسيرة زيادة على سائر الموطئات منها حديث إنما الأعمال بالنية وإنما الأعمال بالنيات. So the correct opinion over here is that this hadith is from Muwaṭṭa through the riwayah of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. We found it. And when Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, he said that was a mistake. In reality, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, he made a mistake over there. And the hadith is found. The ones that did claim that the hadith is in Muwaṭṭa, they were correct. They were correct. Likewise, you have a number of other ahadith such as Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Bay'atain and so on and so forth. So we'll start bi'idhnillahi ta'ala on in the following lesson, inshallah ta'ala. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala with the actual book. And when we start that book, we'll also start with mentioning the sanad between us and Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.